everyone. And can I also begin by saying thanks to our partners for hosting this event today. This is such an important time in the response to the pandemic, where we are on the government's roadmap to reopen our society and communities, where we now have more people than ever been vaccinated and who are benefiting from the vaccination. And their rates of coronavirus are actually quite low now within the city. So we are now poised to re-enter society. And I am keen that we do so as protected as we can be to ensure that we are as resilient as we can be to manage the rest of the pandemic. So what I've been asked to do today is to do a bit of reflection on where we are with the epidemic, to talk about the vaccine program and how vaccines work. And that will provide a basis, I hope, for the conversations that we will be having today. Now, I'll begin by just reflecting a bit on the impact of the pandemic on our city. As you know, we have just finished what has been another severe peak of the epidemic within our city. The peak of infections began just after the 1st of January of this year. And since that time, we've been really managing through the national lockdown, through testing and contact tracing, and of course, through vaccinating, especially older, more vulnerable community members, making sure the vaccine program has been in place. So a combination of all of those things have helped to reduce rates of infections and thankfully deaths from the disease. And this first chart just shows the trends in reports of people who were both diagnosed with COVID and who unfortunately died within 28 days of their first positive test in London. In total, since the beginning of the pandemic, more than 700,000 Londoners have been diagnosed with the infection, and more than 15,000 Londoners have actually died from the infection as well within 28 days of a positive test. So the coronavirus and COVID-19 has had a severe impact, not only on the United Kingdom, but certainly on London as well. And I always begin with this chart because it is both sobering about the toll that this epidemic has had on all of us over the past year. And because of this toll, I know all of us can remember thinking in the spring of last year, in the summer and autumn when infections began going up, and certainly in the peak, how so many of us were saying, my goodness, how soon can we get a vaccine? What can we do to help to put this epidemic behind us? And the vaccine really is the most powerful and the most effective tool that we now have to protect ourselves, to protect our family members and our loved ones from this infection. So now that we are here and more than 30 million adults in the country have received a vaccine, we really are at a point now where we should be taking full advantage of the new technology to protect ourselves. So this is just to remind us about the toll and the journey that we've been on over the past year. Now, over the year itself, we've known that COVID has not randomly affected people in the population, but it has taken a disproportionate toll on some members of our communities. And this includes people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, people who live in more socially or economically disadvantaged parts of our communities. We've seen a disproportionate burden on people who are key workers and people who, for example, have had to continue to go out to work for the course of the pandemic because of the jobs they do and because of the exposure that they may have in the jobs that they do. So we have seen these disproportionate impacts of the pandemic. And this slide just really shows how ethnic groups and various ethnic groups have been affected over the past course of the epidemic, especially as we've gone through nationally the summer period last year when rates were relatively low, the increases that began in September, October as schools began to reopen, and then the massive peak we saw at the New Year's when we began to see the real impact of the new variant. And you can see in this slide that members, especially of South Asian communities, such as Pakistani and Indian, Bangladeshi communities, had much higher rates than other ethnic groups in the country. And that pattern we also saw in London as well. So I could similarly have shown a graph looking at people who are living in more deprived parts of the city and the country, and you'd have seen that disproportionate burden as well. Now, the disproportionality that we see in the impact of the epidemic is also seen in the disproportionality in how people have been taking up the vaccine. Now, one of the very interesting and perhaps somewhat distressing features of the vaccine program so far is that the communities that have been most affected by COVID and who've taken the hardest hit in the pandemic are the ones who are often sometimes the most hesitant about the vaccine and where uptake has been lowest. And again, this slide is looking at the data by ethnic group, and you can see that over time, with the percentage of people who are vaccinated, and that's the cumulative or the total percentage of people who are vaccinated over time. You can see at the beginning of the graph on the left-hand side in December, when we just started the program, there were only very few people who were vaccinated at that time. By January, you can see the numbers going up, and so by February, you begin to see much higher levels and percentages of vaccine coverage. And what this graph really shows is, again, looking by racial and ethnic groups, is that you can see vaccine uptake is highest among, this is national data for England, white ethnic groups. We see differential impacts for South Asian groups, but certainly we see the lowest uptake, especially in the Black ethnic groups, and that's both Black African and Black Caribbean ethnic groups, but that tremendous variation across ethnic groups over time. Now, that hesitancy and that lowered uptake of vaccines is due to many reasons. And as you heard from the bishop in our opening address, sometimes it's because people have legitimate concerns about safety and effectiveness. Sometimes it's because people are mistrustful either of the vaccine, how fast it's been developed, or people's bad experiences with the health service means that that level of trust that they may have and need isn't there. And so, in many of these engagement sessions, I've heard people say, I'm waiting until other people have had it before I make my decision. Well, now that we've had more than 30 million people who've had the vaccine with a very excellent safety profile, I'm really keen to see these differences by social group, by ethnic group, by economic group within our society. We should begin to see those differences reduce. So this is certainly one of the features that we have been seeing with the pandemic. The next key thing that I wanted to just show is just, again, the data on hesitancy. Now, hesitancy is a proportion of people who, when asked if they would take a vaccine, would say that they're either unsure or would say that they were not taking a vaccine. And again, you can see differences by racial and ethnic groups here, but we see similar differences across social and economic status, with people living in more deprived parts of the city and the country having higher levels of hesitancy, people who are in more affluent parts of the city having lower levels of hesitancy and higher levels of uptake. Over time, I'm really pleased to say that the data on hesitancy is improving. And now we see a much lower proportion of especially Black and Asian ethnic groups who are hesitant, and more groups and more communities are saying, yes, I'm ready now to take the vaccine, in part because it's freely available and more people are taking the vaccine. So very quickly, let's just review the vaccination program just to remind you about where we are. You will recall that the policy on the vaccine program is set by the JCVI, which is the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunization, and they provide advice on the priority groups for COVID-19. We began by focusing on the highest priority groups based upon age, because we know that age was the main determinant of having severe disease. The older you were, the more likely you were to be admitted to hospital and to die from the infection. And that is why vaccination programs started with the oldest cohorts and then moved down the age cohorts. So we began with people who were residents in care homes and older adults, and then went through the 80, 75, 70, 65, 55. And today, I believe the government and JCVI announced that they'll be going to the 40 to 49 age group beginning with those aged over 45. And the JCVI today also reinforced that, especially for people of Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, people who have a high body mass index or BMI, who may be obese, people who may be at risk because of their health conditions need to be prioritized as well. And they're encouraging people to take up the vaccine in effort. So the program itself is moving at pace. The government is meeting its targets and is in fact somewhat ahead of its targets in terms of coverage. And because we have reopened society yesterday with more opening of shops and retail and mixing outside, I think the government is also keen that as we emerge into our society, that we are as protected as possible. So a number of people have asked, how do these vaccines actually work, and how can we really be assured about the process? And I'm often asked as well that it seems to have been amazing that we've developed these vaccines in such a short period of time. Can we be sure about their safety and efficacy? Now, the good news is that although the vaccines were developed in a short period of time, the technology that sits behind those vaccines have been developing over years. And so what we've been able to do over the past year has been to have increased political will to develop the vaccines, matched with increased funding to develop the vaccination programs, and a more efficient development as well as assurance and approval process for the vaccines by running various stages of the vaccine development process rather than doing them in series, to do them in parallel. So really looking at a more efficient way of developing the vaccine. And this is because of the nature of the pandemic and the need for us to move quickly. So that is how the vaccines have been developed quickly. They have gone through all of the regulatory processes, and the Medicines and Health Regulatory Agency, the MHRA here in the United Kingdom, oversees the safety and regulation of all vaccines, and all vaccines which are available have gone through the UK regulators. The vaccines work in different ways. For this way, I just want to show really what the Oxford vaccine does. Essentially, you need two things for an effective vaccine. You need some genetic code or particle of the virus that can be introduced into your body in a safe way that will trick the immune system or stimulate the immune system to mount a response to those virus particles, so that if and when the body really meets the virus, the full and virulent virus, that the body is able to mount that immune response. So the vaccine provides a safe way for either virus particles, which can be a part of the genetic code, it can be a part of the surface of the virus itself, to be introduced to the immune system so the immune system can mount a response. And the way you deliver that virus particle is either through viruses which are harmless to humans and have been modified, or other vectors which can be used. And so this slide just really shows that for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, they use another virus which does not cause human illness. They introduce a bit of the genetic code of the coronavirus. And when that genetic code goes into the body, it stimulates the production of particular viral proteins, which then primes the immune system to be able to protect the individual from the real virus when they're exposed to it. So this methodology, this approach is how vaccines work. And this is whether you're looking at measles and mumps, other types of vaccines, that core principle of having a safe delivery system and some element of the virus that you can expose to the body safely is how the vaccines work. Finally, I just wanted to reflect on safety and what we're learning about the next steps with the program. As I mentioned, all vaccines which are available for use in the UK are approved by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agencies, and it has to go through a number of clinical trials and safety checks before they're released. Other vaccines are in the pipeline. All of those are going to be going through the MHRA process, and as and when they're procured by government, they will be made available to us. Today, you may have heard on the news that there are reports about government already beginning to think through the autumn period and whether boosting vaccines will be necessary and how that will be done as well. Really pleased that more than 32 million people now have received their first dose, and we're seeing more people who are having the second dose. For everyone on the call, I cannot underscore enough the importance of having the 2 doses of the vaccine, so you complete the course if it's a 2-dose vaccination schedule, because the level of protection is good with your first dose, but it's best when you receive the full 2 doses. And that's what gets you up to 95% protection. Many of you would have heard about some of the recent concerns about the coronavirus, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. A very, very small risk of blood clots, which have been identified. And this has occurred particularly in younger people with no history of having blood clotting illnesses or any other illnesses that could explain it. Because of this, we are currently recommending that people under 30 without any health conditions, that wherever possible, they're given a choice of either getting the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine or another vaccine if they choose. But again, remember that the risk is very, very low. So just to end then, we have been on a very difficult and challenging time over the past year. All of us have been touched by this pandemic, and all of us have had to deal with changes in our social life or work life, how we engage with family members. I know I haven't seen my parents for nearly 2 years now because of the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic has had. And this has been hard on us emotionally, or physical and mental well-being. There are many tools that we're going to have at our disposal to help get us out of this. The vaccines are one of those tools, and it's the most effective one. But in addition to the vaccines, even when we do receive them, we have to remember to continue to practice the preventive measures: hands, face, space, wearing our face masks, isolating, and of course ensuring that we're ventilating our indoor spaces as well. So really have to think about and remind ourselves about combination prevention as we are living with COVID, as we emerge into the spring and summer. So with that, I'm going to end there, and I look forward to your questions as the session proceeds. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Professor Kevin Fenton. It was really great to have some of that information, and there are a few questions already in the chat, so we'll pull those up as we get to the next part of the conversation. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Mark Pickering, who's Chief Executive of the Christian Medical Fellowship.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you very much, Kevin, for that excellent introduction. So just building on that, I was going to look at some of the moral and theological concerns, particularly that Christian communities have raised about COVID vaccines. The Christian Medical Fellowship is a national organisation for Christian doctors and nurses. We've got about 4,600 members all around the country in all different kinds of disciplines. So our members have been, many of those, fighting COVID in the intensive care units, in the GP practices and elsewhere. So what are the concerns that Christian communities have about the vaccines? Well, some of them are just the same as everyone else. Are they safe? Are they effective? Is the government, overreaching itself and curbing our civil liberties? All these things that we're going through that are unusual for us and a little bit scary, perhaps. Christians are no different to that in worrying about those. Some of them may be largely ethnic or cultural. So here in London, particularly when a large percentage of the Christian community may be from Black or Asian backgrounds, then there may be particular ethnic groups or cultural views that church community may have that's different to specifically being a Christian. So I think, as Kevin's already said, there may be concerns about racism in healthcare. Is the NHS actually looking out for people like me, for my community? Do we trust the health service? Do we trust the government? There are lots of overlaps there. And some of the concerns are more specific to Christians. So they're some of the ones I'll look at in the coming slides. But I think it's important to recognize that almost all of these come down to trust more than to evidence. because it's easy for us to think, well, all we have to do is, have Boris Johnson and Chris Whitty out there on the news conference giving us the charts and saying, here we go. We might go one step better than that and have Kevin there doing the same thing because he looks really friendly, doesn't he? I mean, who could not trust Professor Fenton? But if you think, well, this is the establishment, this is the government, I don't like the government, they don't like me, they don't look out for people like me, then you will always find someone else with another study or another theory or another bit of evidence that you can trust. And so most important with all of this is, who do you trust? The people who are giving you this different information. Do you trust the information that they're giving you? And so we can see very much that different people will look at exactly the same information and read it completely different ways. Evidence is really important, but it's not the whole matter. So why might Christians be more wary? Well, here are a few things, a few Christian beliefs that I think are relatively important here. So firstly, the world is not necessarily the way that people tell you. People often tell you that, we just evolved in a mindless, directionless process. There's no God. Once you die, you just rot. There's nothing beyond the grave. And of course, Christians will say, that's not the way the world is. I know that. And then there are dark forces out to mislead you. People are out to deceive you, to turn you away from the gospel and from your belief. And that's obviously true in many ways. Now, often Christians will think, well, society's against Christians. We're persecuted. We've always been persecuted. People don't like Christians. And then, of course, many of us believe that we're in the end times, these eschatological views. If you read the book of Revelation and you see some of the amazing things that happen in there, these amazing figurative prophecies, well, what does that mean? That something is going to happen. There'll be times, particularly when the world turns against Christians. So these are beliefs that are common to all Christians to some extent, more so or expressed differently in some communities, and they may all be true at times, but the question is, when are they true? In what ways are they true, and to what extent are they true? So we need to be very careful about how we put these beliefs together, but it can mean that some Christian communities particularly are more vulnerable to the kind of harmful conspiracy theories that we have heard shared. Because when we put all those together, I think sometimes we can get a perfect storm. So many Christian communities will believe that COVID's not as serious as we're being told. We hear lots of people saying, oh, Sweden got it right. They didn't lock down. They were okay. All we need to do is, keep our old people out of the way until we've all got this herd immunity and everything will be fine. Lots of skepticism about lockdown. There's many different views about exactly what was the best thing to do, but lots of people will be skeptical about, did the government get it right? Did any government get it right that's locking down and isolating communities? Then there's views that governments and big business are actually conspiring together to control us. We might quite justifiably have some concerns about some of the way that big pharmaceutical companies can operate. We all know that there have been scandals. We all know there have been some research scandals. And the question is that operating here or not? Do you trust the World Health Organization? Many in America do not. We do more in the UK, but these big multinational organizations, many Christians have a distrust of those instinctively. And then this idea that the church is being persecuted. Well, look around you. Churches have been closed. We can't sing in church. We can't take mass or communion. These are not just like going to the golf club or the cinema. These are essential services for Christians. And so if Christians feel that they're being treated unfairly or persecuted, well, that's not going to make them trust the same government that's telling them all about COVID and the vaccines. And so the conclusion can be, we have to stand strong against this. We have to resist all this misinformation from the government and the health service. If you've read the book of Revelation, you know about the mark of the beast, this frightening thing that will happen in the end times that we must stand firm against. What does it tell you? That you would receive a mark, and without it you can't buy or sell. hang on, doesn't that sound a little bit like a COVID vaccine passport? Oh my goodness. You can understand how many Christians might look at those things and put them all together and be very worried by it. And then what about links to abortion? So we know that viruses, they're very different to bacteria. They only grow inside living cells. And many of the cell cultures, these so-called immortalized cell lines, they do come from historic abortions. HEK293, PERC6, these are cell lines that are used in the production of some of the vaccines that we're familiar with. Now, mostly these come from a single abortion back in the 1970s or 1980s, and the cells taken from them, they will reproduce for many years because they've been altered to do that. But the question is, well, if abortion is morally wrong, how can we benefit from it? How can I, take a treatment that comes, even distantly from the death of an innocent child? Now, there are some misunderstandings in these situations. Many people have thought that there is actual fetal tissue, actual bits of dead baby inside the vaccines. That is not true. Many people have thought that current abortions today are being used for the production of vaccines. That is not true. And yet there are these historic links which we need to be aware of. So the AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccines, they use some of these abortion-derived cells in the production of the vaccines. And the Pfizer and Moderna ones, the mRNA vaccines, they do use some of these cells back in the testing. So it is one step further back, but there has been some involvement of that. There are some vaccines that don't use fetal-derived cells. So I understand the CureVac vaccine is free of that, but it's not yet available for use. And weighing up all of these things, interestingly, the Vatican, the Catholic Church that is often very strongly pro-life and anti-abortion, the Vatican has said it's okay to use these vaccines because the seriousness of the pandemic combines with being very distant from the original abortion that might have led to the cells that are being used. And so the Catholic Church has said, on balance, we think you should go ahead and get these vaccines. But of course, Protestants don't have the same hierarchy. It doesn't matter to Protestants what the Pope says in general. And so individual churches or communities will take their own views on that. Now, there are some calls for vaccines to be produced and made available without links to abortion. I think that's very important, but this is something we could think about longer term. It's not something we can think about this year or next year when we really just need to get the pandemic under control. So putting all of that together, that's some of the reasons why I think many Christian communities are really anxious and hesitant about the vaccine in a way that others may not be. What's important? I think it's really important to have church leaders understanding the issues and able to speak up about it. If they can say that, I've looked at the evidence, I've looked at the moral questions, and I do think that on balance we should be taking that. And especially if you've got church leaders from different ethnicities, denominations, people that look like you, that think and speak like you, that have the same shade of belief that you do as well. That's really important to build that trust. I think we do have to take seriously these moral concerns about links to abortion. Often it just passes people by. I once did a BBC interview with even a Christian journalist from the BBC, and I really had to convince him hard that this wasn't just some crazy conspiracy theory, that there was an actual historic link to abortion in the production of that, because he just thought we were talking about, is there actual fetal tissue in the vaccines? It's really important as well to engage positively with faith communities. If you're basically just saying you need to shut down your church, not operate, don't cause trouble, then of course groups will feel persecuted. But it's really important to say, well, look, here's how we can get you to do the good work that you're doing, to be the best that you can, to operate and to support your community in a way that is safe. I've put a couple of websites on there, the Christian Medical Fellowship, cmf.org.uk, and John Wyatt, who's our president, johnwyatt.com. There's some really good COVID-related resources on there. One of our publications that we put out regularly is called the CMF File. That's just a few pages of basic information that most people can read. And there's one just coming out on vaccines in general that's really helpful on this. I think it's really important as well to avoid any impression of coercion. That's why things like vaccine passports, I think we have to be really careful about that. You know, any churches who are being told, you know, you must have vaccination proof before people can come into your services, that's going to be like a red rag to a bull for many Christian congregations. So thanks very much, and back to you, Melissa.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. And it was really great to hear about some of those theological concerns and what could be done to address them. It was really good, I think, to have that practical advice as well. So I'm going to pass on to our final speaker before we head to the questions. That's Dr. Garrick Wilson of Imperial College London.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And also thanks for inviting me to this forum. Thanks to Professor Fenton and Dr. Mark for the great presentations that just went ahead just now. I want to do something slightly different, and it's to, in a way, bring all of that together. And I'm not going to show you a presentation. I just want to have a conversation with you. I want to talk to you briefly. And I was asked to speak on broader theological concerns. So by training, I'm a scientist. I work in science at Imperial College London, but I'm also a minister at a thriving Pentecostal church in London. And that church is part of a denomination which is the largest Black Pentecostal movement in the United Kingdom, with around 33,000 followers and 100 branches across the United Kingdom. And so I do speak to a lot of Black Pentecostals in terms of their views on the vaccine and their thinking around the subject matter. Just to bring that into some context and also in relation to what was said before me, I just want to say to you, just growing up in the church, and I am a Pentecostal Christian, just growing up in the church, you get a sense from the older generation that for them, justice and liberation is ultimately being taken away from this world, in that they would have faced so much trauma that all they looked forward to was going to heaven. As we go into a new generation, we're talking about millennials, Generation Z, you hear a different conversation. It is not just heavenly minded or being heavenly minded, but also being earthly good as well, which means that there is a cause to fight whilst we're still here. There's a cause to champion whilst we're still here, and we will not leave here until we feel that we have ultimately achieved justice. This segues into a branch of theology called liberation theology. And this aspect of theology is to do with interpreting the Gospels through lived experience. And many Black Pentecostals now are looking at the conversation around vaccination, and they're interpreting it through lived experience. I'm going to start by saying that indeed our survival and our liberation depends upon the recognition of truth when it is revealed. And if we cannot recognize truth, then how then will we be liberated from what is not truth? To know truth is to appropriate it. It's not merely to have a reflection on it or a theory about it. Truth is action entering our lives and leading to liberation. It is the liberating presence of the oppressed, building up those who are torn down and propping them up on every side where they are leaning. Truth is found wherever people struggle for justice, wherever they fight for the right to live, to have the right to pursue life and liberty. One of the big problems here is that the word vaccine doesn't appear in the scriptures. And if it did appear within the canon of biblical texts, then perhaps this would have been an easier conversation for us to have. What do we do then as Christians? How do we conclude as Christians when we can't find a clear answer from the scriptures as to what to do about this? From the Pentecostal distinctives, we are taught to be vigilant, to always be sober-minded. And that means to be watchful. That means to be cautious, to be careful, to really scrutinize everything. And the pandemic itself has caused our vigilance to come into action more than ever before, certainly within my lifetime. And the question then is, how do we contextualize vaccines, COVID-19 within our theological framework? For some, it started out as disbelief in that there was something else going on here. It was sinister. There was really no outbreak of a virus. There's no need for a vaccine. And that became even more compounded when faith leaders themselves didn't have the answers to the questions that followers or the faithful were asking. That led to them to be or rather to search for information in other avenues or other places. And part of the problem we have now, why we're having these conversations, trying to educate and inform people correctly, is because those who would misinform got ahead of the curve. They got ahead of us, and they proliferate or propagate a lot of misinformation out there. I myself have seen a lot of WhatsApp messages coming through with information that are just incredulous. And nonetheless, these are passed on at an incredible rapid rate. And so that became normal for a lot of people, or in shaping their view before the real information got out there. So there's that to consider. And of course, because these many theories have gone forth with enthusiasm, with a zeal, many people distrust those who will then come, and they don't seem to be as zealous in promoting information around the safety, the efficacy, and the need for the vaccines. The force at which these explanations went forth were contrary to the advice that was being delivered by the government, for example. And when we consider that within the context of inequalities, historical inequalities and injustices, then that says to us, okay, we must not trust the government at all. And not only do we look at this from the perspective of historical injustices and inequalities, we look at this from the perspective of current injustices and inequalities playing out right in front of our eyes. When we have to live in a world that says take a vaccine, but at the same time, we are arguing or pretty much knocking at your doors for you to admit that Black lives do matter, then there is now a lack of confidence, because we're having one conversation with you and you're trying to have another conversation with us. When we live in a world where our lived experiences are sidelined, and it is now said that there is no issue here when it comes to institutional racism, and in the next sentence, the same institutions are saying to us, you need to take the vaccine, there is this mistrust now in that you've just sidelined our lived experiences. How then can we take confidence in what you have to say to us around taking the vaccines? Every church leader within the Black Pentecostal faith must now contend with membership or followers who presents these issues. And every church leaders within this context must now fight a cause of justice. What is right? What is equitable for their people? And of course, we have to then, as I said, reconcile this within the conversation of faith. It is one that takes into account, as was said by Mark, Christian ethics and morals. It is also one that takes into account prophecy. And when I speak about prophecy here, put simply, it is to know the will or the intention of God's heart. Many would have started out, and this is something we do within the Pentecostal distinctive. We start out each year by setting a prophetic vision for the body of Christ. So many would have started out 2020. 2020 is linked to 2020 vision. So many would have started out the year 2020 to say it's the year of vision. It's the year of absolute clarity. Not many or any would have seen the coming virus and the viral pandemic. And as a result, a lot of people start questioning the correct nature of their prophetic utterances. And therefore that created another problem. What do we do? How do we understand this within the context of our prophecy? Mark also mentioned eschatology. And what we're talking about there, put simply, is a branch of theology concerned with the history or the end time of the world as we know it. Is this the mark of the beast? From a Pentecostal distinctive, we're taught that the mark of the beast is during a time called the tribulation. This comes after Jesus returns to take away those who believe who are alive, and also to resurrect those who were believers who had passed away. It is after that that the mark of the beast is revealed. And as was said, that is needed in order to do transactions, whether that be buying or selling. Now, the question I would ask then for those who are here from a Pentecostal distinctive, if that is the case, as we are taught from the scriptures, and we believe that the vaccine is the mark of the beast, then it would mean that Christ already returned and we would have been left behind. And I do believe that would be a greater tragedy to contend with. So we are being, I don't want you to see all of this as conspiracy theories or misinformation. I think there's a level of scrutiny that is taking place here as well. And as I said at the outset, we are being vigilant. We've always been taught to be vigilant and to be sober-minded, to question, to review, to scrutinize. And this is what's happening here. There's a scrutiny. So what is going on here? Is it politicians that we don't trust trying to be our saviors and our liberators overnight? That cannot work. What is going on here? Is it science which is not done properly and robustly, rushing through a vaccine which is not good for us? Is that what's going on here? Did God cause this, and should we live through it and trust him that he's going to be our ultimate liberator and our ultimate savior in all of this? These are all the questions that we're contending with. Are we really in the end times where it's the time for the mark of the beast? Can we put this within the context of biblical prophecy? Is that what's going on here? And with all these questions coming through, you now have the young generation who says, actually, there's more that's going on here. There's a system that we need to fight, that we need to stand up against, that we need to march again and protest against. And we need to also position ourselves such that we can get into those key areas where we are able to lobby and inform policies and practices. And these are some of the things that are taking place here. What would I say to all of this? In the absence of a clear verse in the scriptures that says, take the vaccine, thou shalt take the vaccine. How do we reconcile this? To us Christians, we believe in the work of the Holy Spirit. The scripture is very clear that he is a counselor, in that he will lead us into all things truth. And in other words, if we don't know the truth, or we can't trust the sources out there, the Holy Spirit will lead us into all truth. And I would urge you then to take that directive in this. In doing so, you will be able to recognize some key distinctions. Firstly, you'll be able to recognize the distinction between politics and science. And I don't want you to make a decision on the vaccine based on your political beliefs or your political disbeliefs. I want you to make a decision purely on the science fact. Professor Fenton presented some of these facts earlier on. And look at that data, and that is the data that you should follow the information on. Secondly, how do we come to a conclusion on this? I want you to also make a decision on, Mark spoke about life, and of course the use of fetal cells, for example. We are very pro-life believers in that we're protective of life. Make a decision based that this is not just for me on an individual level, but the decision I make affects a wider community of people, in that if I decide to take the vaccine, it stops me from being able to transmit the virus, or reduces that possibility of being able to transmit the virus to others who may be susceptible or vulnerable within my community. So this is about justice, and it's about what is equitable. And so we must understand those around us as well and be responsible for them. Likewise, we are responsible for ourselves. So that's something we must also bring into this conversation, in that what I do will affect others around me. I don't want to speak for too long because I do want to leave space for question, but I will conclude with Deuteronomy 30 and 19 for those who are looking for a scriptural position. And it says, I call heaven and earth as a witness against you, and I set before you life and death. I set before you blessings and curses. And it's up to you now to choose. But my suggestion for you, according to the scripture, it says, choose life so that you and your children might live. I believe, and I'm a Christian, that to take the vaccine is life. There is enough data now to show that it reduces hospitalizations. There is enough data now to show that it reduces death. And that certainly is supportive of life. I've taken the vaccine myself. I'm a young man, but my work puts me at increased risk of exposure to COVID-19, and therefore I have opted to take the vaccine. I'm absolutely fine. It's been several weeks later. I've had no significant side effects, and I am well. And I want to say that once we get past this, there's a bigger work of justice to do, and so we must not be so sidetracked by this that we stay here indefinitely, because after lockdown, after COVID-19, there's a bigger work to be done, in that a lot of businesses were shut down. How do we rebuild our economy? What is the role of Christians in that process? Many individuals' mental health would have been affected adversely during this lockdown. How do we begin now to rebuild those individuals and prop them up in society? There are many disparities that would have come out of this. How do we then go forward and champion communities to have greater prosperity prosperity in life later on. There's a bigger work to do after this. And I do believe it is not a sin to take the vaccine. I don't believe that God will punish or chastise you for taking the vaccine. I do believe, however, he wants us to get on with the bigger work, because many people are suffering the longer we carry this on. And that's where I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Garrick. That was excellent. And it's really good to have that kind of call to arms to us all at the end. And exactly as you said, there's bigger work to be done. So I really look forward to seeing some of the great work that you're going to do in the future as well. So we had a few questions come in quite early in the chat. We had one that was asking about how do you contend with sort of young people who might have concerns around fertility, because that still hasn't been, that's still not been made very clear. And I've seen quite a lot of the conspiracy theories that have been circulating. They talk about sort of the fact that there's that line around fertility and pregnancy and how we don't know the exact concerns. That's kind of a popular one. Also, there were some questions around if you take the first dose, can you decline taking the second dose? And a question about, does the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine rise if there is 10 to 12 weeks between doses, because someone's GP is calling them after 6 to 7 weeks? So if we could deal with maybe that group of questions first, and if anyone has any further questions, pop them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function and I'll try and spot you, and you can ask a question as well. So I don't know who wants to tackle those ones first. Kevin?
I have to start off with the fertility question, and I've just put a resource in the chat for colleagues. This is one of the questions that we get quite a bit of concern about, because there's a bit of misinformation circulating about it. At the moment, there is no theoretical reason why the vaccine itself should affect fertility, either in men or women. In part because there's nothing, either with the content of the vaccine, the mechanism of how the vaccines work, or the immune response that would have an impact on fertility. And as we have now rolled the vaccine out to millions of people, as you can see, we're looking for side effects and any concerns that may appear. There have been no reports of any concerns on fertility at this time. And I wouldn't expect there to be any, given what we know about the vaccines. Some people, I think, had been initially concerned because pregnant women were not included in the initial randomized controlled trials and studies which were done in the development of the vaccine. This is standard procedure for development of new therapies. You do not test them on pregnant women until you're out, or women who are considering pregnancy, because you want to ensure that the vaccine is safe for all populations first, and then you have either specialist studies or you begin rolling the vaccines. As vaccines are rolled out, you counsel and encourage and monitor the impact in pregnant women. So just to reassure you that the data now is clear, no impacts on fertility for women who are pregnant or who are considering having children. Having a conversation with your provider is what we encourage if you're pregnant, to have that discussion, because getting COVID and being pregnant carries a higher risk, a much higher risk of an adverse outcome than, of course, getting the vaccine. So I'll pause there on that question. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Is there anything you wanted to pick up, Garrick, around some of the questions that have come in about the vaccine?
Thank you, Melissa. I think there was an earlier question, and I'm just trying to scroll back to make sure I got it right. And I think it was from Ross Locker, in saying that they've received a text from a young person and didn't know what answer to give back to them regarding taking the vaccine. And I think there in that text, there was a wording that talks about the mRNA vaccines and how this has not been done before, because mRNA directly programmed the body into producing specific proteins. And I just want to clear up that one line, in that the mRNA technology is not programming into the body, because I think when it's phrased like that, it gives this idea of gene therapy. And we have to be very careful about that, because gene therapy is deliberately or altering your DNA somehow. And I want to make that very clear, that this technology does not alter one's DNA, and therefore there's no cellular programming taking place. In order for that to happen, it would have to get to your nucleus. And in order for something to get to your nucleus, it has to have a specific nuclear localization sequence. That's what we call it. So think of your nucleus, the part of your cell that encodes or encloses your DNA. It's got these pores on it, and they're like little doorways, and not anything can go across those doorways unless they have what I call, what I've just said is a nuclear localization sequence. Within the sequence of the RNA that's used for these vaccines, there isn't that nuclear localization sequence. So there is nothing that's going to get into your DNA and cause any form of reprogramming. So I think I just need to be extremely clear about that, and that there's no gene therapy or genetic manipulation that is taking place here through the use of these vaccines.
Thank you very much, Garrick. That's a really helpful answer. And thank you also for all of you who've been present here this evening. It's been good for us to be together, and there's some more questions as well. I'm Phil Barnard. I'm the team leader for London Baptist. Some of you look familiar to me for sure, and it's been good for us to work alongside the GLA to put on this event. I guess one of the questions that I was quite interested came from Councillor Johnson, and he talked about trust and this question of Big Pharma and the Gates Foundation wanting to use Africans for trials which impact on the Black community. Is there anything some of the panelists could say about that? Because that's certainly some of the things that I've heard in some of the church members that I know. So I don't know if it's Professor Fenton or someone else who needs to offer on that.
I'm not sure if the question was specifically on coronavirus vaccines or vaccines more generally, and why we see the development of vaccines not only in Africa but in many developing countries. And there are three key things that I am always mindful of with the importance of the development of vaccines. Number one, in many resource poor or disadvantaged countries, the death of infectious diseases still accounts for the vast majority of mortality, both for adults but especially children. And so there is a need for us to continue the science and the development of vaccines to help to reduce the mortality, the death and the burden of those illnesses in these countries. And that's why the investment in vaccines and effective vaccine programs is especially important for developing country settings or resource poor settings. Second, we know that for all new technologies, we want to ensure there's more diversity, both in the researchers who are undertaking the research and the people who are involved in the scientific development of these technologies. So that when vaccines become available, we know that they've been tested on people that look like us, that come from a variety of backgrounds, and that we understand the impact. And that is why you see increasingly for vaccines which are going to be used globally, development takes place both within developing as well as in the developed world. And then finally, there's something about ensuring that the technology, the tools, the scientific know-how to develop these technologies do not always remain in the global north, but we begin the process of transferring technology, transferring the skills, so that especially in developing country settings, they can begin to look at vaccine production, the science of developing vaccines and so forth. And you're beginning to see that with the coronavirus pandemic, where African countries, South Asian countries are beginning now to be sites for development of vaccines, vaccine technology, and so forth. So for all of those reasons, I welcome the investment of Gates into developing countries. And perhaps the way of viewing it is about how we transfer technology, how we build capacity, and ensure that there's more equity in the science related to these vaccine developments.
Thank you, Professor. That's very interesting. There's a question that's just come up from Rick. Question about good health enabling a stronger protection from COVID-19. Should we be encouraging this more? Well, we've got several doctors on the call. Maybe Mark or Garrick, you'd like to take that one?
I don't know if Mark is still here. Is Mark still here? Or is he gone?
Okay, Garrick, maybe you then.
Is Mark here? Okay, so this is something that comes up frequently, especially in conversations with me. You know, there are other ways to boost our immune systems, whether it be through diet, supplement, etc. And therefore, the vaccine is not needed. Can I just say that none of that is standardized, in the sense that there's no way you can control for the level of immunity that you'll get from taking vitamin D, for example, or eating certain types of food. What the vaccine certainly offers is an efficacious response in priming your immune system that will give you the protection, the level of protection that you need against the virus. And also, because it's not standardized, what a diet will do in me may do completely different in Professor Fenton, just because of how our body may metabolize what we're doing. And so we can't standardize that process. And therefore, I'll say to you, anyone who's exploring these methods, etc., that's no way to standardize the process. And please do think into that some more.
Okay.
I'll say, Garrick, I agree with what you just said. We know that being in poor health has been the biggest factor for worsening COVID outcomes. So in order to maximize your well-being with COVID, in addition to protecting yourself with a vaccine, do think about what you need to do to, if you are overweight, to ensure that you lose weight, because we know that obesity has been a risk factor for severe disease and death. We know that having your multiple long-term conditions, diabetes, hypertension, chronic kidney disease, a number of long-term conditions, those should be well managed in order for us to be more resilient. But it does not take the place of the vaccine, as Garrick has said. And finally, given what we know about the impact of the pandemic on mental health and well-being, I'd like us to think not only about what we do to be resilient physically, but what we do to be resilient spiritually and mentally as well, because of the short and medium-term impacts of COVID and its impact on our emotional well-being. So just to add that to the response as well.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple more questions now, I think, before we start to round off. Time has flown, and they're still coming in at the bottom in the chat. Just a couple of one brief question maybe. After this is from earlier from Sharon, I've read that after the first or second dose, the body can become immune to the vector. Does this mean we should have a different vaccine for any booster? Is that a yes or no question, Professor?
I think in the press today, there's some discussion about doing a booster with another vaccine so that you challenge the body in a different way. And it's just to maximize the protection that we have. But we will see what the scientific advice from SAGE is on this. And I wouldn't want to speculate on what the autumn plan is going to be in terms of the booster at this stage.
Okay. Okay. And Garrick, there was a question about the Imperial vaccine that you've heard, that they've heard much about. Is that happening in your establishment?
So I can't speak officially on that, but what I can say to you is Imperial is very much now focused on technology to respond to variants that may present themselves, or boosters that may respond to variants that may present themselves in the population. So there is some effort going into that at the moment. And that's all I can say on that particular point. Okay.
Okay. And one final question. Josephine has come up at the very end with a big question about the government. Obviously, we've been through a lot this year, and I'm sure many of us have different views about the political scene and indeed what the government has said and done at various points. How can we be expected to trust the government when they've been economic with the information regarding the vaccine? I mean, there is a question here about blood clots. I mean, I know that's been in the news even today, Professor. I mean, there's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Is there any final comment you'd like to offer about that?
Josephine, thank you. I understand your concerns. And, you know, as I said in my brief opening comments, in the midst of a pandemic, when we have to move quickly, safely and effectively, we are learning as we are implementing. And with the vaccine, although we are assured about its safety, as millions and millions more people receive the vaccines, we are going to find side effects which perhaps were not identified at the beginning. And this process of learning is a key part of implementation of any new drug, right? So whether it's a vaccine or something that you take for high blood pressure, diabetes, it's what happens. The more people use it, is the more you understand its safety profile. So what I think is key here is that we listen to the MHRA, the regulatory body. We understand what the scientists are saying, Professor Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, and Sage, and then we pull that information together to inform policy. As and when we need to change policy, we will. But bear in mind that our learning will continue as our experience with these vaccines increases, and that may well change policy, but it doesn't mean that we were being economical with the truth at the beginning. It just means that we're learning more as we're implementing them.
That's really great. Thanks, Kevin. So we're heading towards our close time. So if there's any sort of last comments you'd like to make, Garrick, and then I'll pass back to Kevin for some final comments. And then I think we will close tonight's meeting. But just to say before that, I'll share the recording with everyone who was on the, who registered by email. And of course, if you have sort of church leaders or fellow Christians that you'd like to share that with, that's absolutely fine. So keep an eye out for that tomorrow morning, probably, rather than tonight, because it will take a while to download. But yeah, any final comments, Garrick?
Thank you, Melissa. Just want to say, I think what we have learned throughout all of this is the absolute need to be more engaged with scientific research, and just looking at the breakdown of some of the demographics used in the vaccine development. I think in particular, the Pfizer vaccine, there was around 10% of individuals from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds that was included there. But something that I have observed over time being in science is that people of ethnic minority groups don't generally tend to engage with research and development, with trials and how these things work. And one thing I would say to any community leader here, any political leader, any church leader, is to advocate or really impress upon those who you have leadership over to actually engage more with the scientific process in understanding how this works. I would also say too, if you have building and space, open up those buildings such that individuals can come through and give credible information, host seminars, inspire the younger generations that you have oversight of to even go forward, especially those from a minority ethnic background, go forward and study the sciences at universities, to go into medicine, to go into research. I think that process of building starts even now, such that when something like this happens, we don't have to say, well, we don't hear or see people that look like us talking about it, therefore we can't trust it. Let's put the groundwork in and say, you know what, there is a part for us to do in this as well. And I really encourage you to begin to do that even now. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Garrick. And passing back to you, Professor Fenton.
Yeah, you know, I always love hearing Garrick speak because he's just so passionate. And one of the things you said this evening, Garrick, is the importance of thinking about viewing the vaccine as an enabler so that we can get on to the things that really matter to us, right? Because the impact of this pandemic on our communities, on our families, on our physical and mental health and well-being means that whatever we can do to get this behind us, to protect ourselves so we can get back to the work of rebuilding our communities, rebuilding our city, rebuilding our society is going to be key. And you know, what we've spoken about today is one of the most effective tools that we all have to protect ourselves. And I hope that the conversations today reassure you of both the evidence behind why vaccines are important, the theoretical and the spiritual sort of underpinnings of an approach to thinking about vaccinations, but most importantly, what it will enable us to do and how we can look towards a better and more fairer society as we emerge from this. And we need all of us healthy and prepared to be able to do that. So I think my final word is around the vaccine enabling us to do the work that now needs to be done as we rebuild after this pandemic. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Kevin. And thanks so much, Garrick, and of course, Mark, who joined us earlier, and thanks to Phil for his great hosting of the questions and answers as well. So that's it for tonight, everyone. We've managed to finish on time, which is great. So as I said, we'll stay in touch. You'll all receive the recording from me tomorrow morning. And there were some really useful resources posted in the chat as well. So do have a look at them and share them with other people that you might think are interested. And hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Kevin.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.